Up until May 2009, Christopher West was a reasonably uncontroversial Catholic expert on sexual ethics. But during an appearance on ABC News, the popular speaker and author raised eyebrows by comparing John Paul II with Playboy founder Hugh Hefner. Both, he claimed, were reacting against a negative puritanical view of sexuality and the human body that is incompatible with the Catholic worldview. While taken in context, the remark was never an endorsement of Hefner. It was enough to spark a very public debate about West's interpretation of John Paul II's theology of the body. I asked him about his approach before a recent conference in Toronto. He was characteristically candid, as were his many supporters in attendance, who credit him with advancing a truly Catholic sexual revolution.
I think it's revolutionary because people think when it comes to sex that the Catholic Church says, no, don't do this, don't do that, and it's all negative, and theology of the body is, no, it's not negative, it's positive.
They want to know what is holy and good about this gift of our sexuality, and that message is being, I guess, proclaimed very clearly by Christopher West.
I think people are really just, they're sort of surprised by the candor of it all. And I think that people are just open to the truth, and when somebody speaks the truth so boldly, they just want to listen.
John Paul II is a great theologian, and some of the language that he uses in Theology of the Body is somewhat difficult to comprehend, and I've read some of the original text. And Christopher West has a way of presenting that so that everybody can understand it.
I joined a Theology of the Body study, and I had come to know that my marriage was exactly what it was supposed to be, and it gave me answers that I had been longing for as a small child. And it was wonderful, and it gave me answers for all of the difficult things I had gone through in my life.
I'm here with author, speaker, resident fellow, and faculty member of the Theology of the Body Institute, Christopher West. Christopher, you speak of the body in wholly positive terms, but you also say there have been distortions in our perceptions of sexuality. How did we lose, and how do we rediscover God's plan?
John Paul II begins his whole catechesis on the human body and sexuality, called Theology of the Body, by reflecting on the words of Christ about the beginning. The Pharisees come to Jesus to question him about divorce, and Jesus says, Moses allowed you to divorce because of the hardness of your hearts, but from the beginning it was not so. So Jesus points us back to the beginning, before sin distorted it, and there we see a vision of the human body and sexuality in which man and woman were both naked and felt no shame. John Paul says this nakedness without shame is the key for understanding God's original plan for us, because it reveals the sentiment of their heart. In looking at one another, they weren't desiring to use one another as an object or grasp at the other as a thing. They saw the plan of love revealed in the body. That's what we have lost. How did we lose it? We lost it through the mystery of original sin. We've been blinded to who we really are as men and women. It's almost as if we have amnesia, but there's still kind of a distant memory. Deep in the heart, John Paul speaks of an echo in the human heart of the original plan. So throughout human history, we have longed to regain this pure love that we had in the beginning. And the gift of the gospel is that Christ comes precisely, as the Catechism says, Christ comes to restore creation to the purity of its origins.
It's evident that there are many Catholics who are eager to hear this good news. But how ready, broadly speaking, is the Catholic community to engage in frank discussions of faith and sexuality?
There are some in the church who are ready and willing and see the need to really have open, honest conversation about this topic. I think there are others who are still afraid, maybe understandably reacting against the widespread profaning of the body and sexuality that's going on in the culture by thinking the response should be just don't talk about it. I don't believe silence is an option. The cat is out of the bag, so to speak. The sexual revolution has compelled us to have this conversation. And if you look back at church history, whenever a crisis arises in the church and in the world, the Holy Spirit grants the church what she needs when she needs it. A great theologian is raised up at the time of a great crisis to respond to it. And the crisis of our day is a crisis in the question of human sexuality. What does it mean to be male and female? That is at the root of so many of the problems of the modern world. Well, again, the Holy Spirit has granted us a great theological mind, has raised this mind up, John Paul II, to give us this profound, beautiful, sacred, reverent vision of human sexuality, and we mustn't be afraid to talk about it.
But how would you respond to those who say that we're already focused too much on sex, too eager, even in church circles, to attribute our dysfunctions to distorted sexuality?
Sure, I understand that objection, and here's what I would say in response, that yes, we can have a tendency to be hyper-focused on our sexuality based on what's going on in the culture. And what I would say there's far too much of is a distorted conversation about our sexuality, a distorted focus on our sexuality. But what is needed is to untwist what has been twisted up. All sin is a twisting of what God created to be true, good, and beautiful. And we mustn't throw out the baby with the bathwater here. The mystery of redemption is not a throwing away. It is an untwisting of what's been twisted up. And we come to see the body and the mystery of sexuality, as St. Paul talks about it, as a great mystery that refers to Christ and the church. In fact, John Paul says that passage in Ephesians chapter 5, where St. Paul links the one flesh union of spouses with the union of Christ and the church, he says in a certain way, this is a summa, or a compendium, a summary of everything God wants to tell us about who He is and who we are. This is precisely what we must be pondering. This is precisely what we must be entering into to understand more fully who we are as male and female and how that reveals the mystery of God's plan of love.
Earlier this year, because of an interview you did with ABC News, your work became a subject of debate among Catholic academics. What did it mean for you then to receive the full unequivocal endorsement of Cardinal Justin Regale and Bishop Kevin Rhodes soon thereafter?
Yeah, well, I want to say a word first about my critics, and I want to thank them. I've listened very closely to my critics and their criticisms over the years, and it has helped me to refine my presentations a great deal. When I started this work in the late 90s, I was very green. And I kind of came out with both guns blazing, and I look back at some of the things I said and said, ooh, I would never say it that way today. So I acknowledge my need for refinement. This is a process of trial and error, trying to put this very dense theology in a language that normal people can understand. It's pretty much uncharted territory. So yeah, it's a process of trial and error, and if people are looking for faults in me, I assure them they will always be able to find them. The Lord chooses the weak and the broken to do His work. Who else does He have? A very wise bishop once said to me, this was a few years ago when my ministry was really taking off, he said, "Christopher, you'll come to see that your critics will demand perfection of you." And I humbly admit, I don't have perfection to give. It's not something that any human being can claim. That said, within the church, we do have a structure and authority, and when the controversy broke earlier in the year, I went to my local bishops, Bishop Kevin Rhodes and Cardinal Regale, and I have a close working relationship with both of them. I submitted the matter to them. They looked at the matter closely, and they issued their statement. And I do take great comfort in that my ministry is not perfect, no one's is, but it's on the right track, and I think they see the value of what I'm trying to do, and I do take great comfort in that.
While many Catholics are developing a great enthusiasm for theology of the body, it seems that a lot are still not accepting church teaching on abstinence, particularly and contraception. What do you see as the main obstacles to greater acceptance of these teachings?
The Church's first line in the Catechism of the Catholic Church on the section on morality, it is not follow all these oppressive rules or you're going to hell. It's not what morality is all about. The first line in the Catechism section on morality is this: Christian recognize your dignity. The moral life is about recognizing our greatness, recognizing who we really are as men and women, waking up from that amnesia I was talking about earlier. We're all hungry for love, and the moral life is about not settling for counterfeit love. Where do we go to feed that hunger? Well, the culture has a fast food menu, and the culture says, come bring your hunger here and we'll give you all this greasy fast food. Immediate pleasure, immediate gratification, fine and dandy, but you know what happens when we eat that fast food? It clogs our arteries, we get sick. The truth of the church's teaching on sexuality is confirmed, I would submit, in the wounds of the culture that rejects it.
And what are those wounds? Like, what is really at stake here? Contraception has become arguably the greatest battle line dividing Catholics from other Catholics. Some question whether this is really a battle worth fighting.
What is at stake is the truth of love, which is to say, what is at stake is the truth of our humanity. What is at stake is the very crux and core of the gospel itself. What's at the core of the gospel? It's the call to love in the image and likeness of God. The new commandment Jesus gives us is love one another as I have loved you. And one of the great gifts of John Paul's Theology of the Body is that it helps us to see that this call to love, that fundamental gospel call to love as Christ loves, is literally chiseled by God right in our bodies, right in our sexuality. Sexuality is a call to love as Christ loves. Husbands, love your wives. How? As Christ loves the church. And yes, the one flesh union, that intimate embrace of husband and wife, is meant to be an image and indeed a participation in the very love of Christ. When we render the act sterile, we are removing something utterly essential to the sacramental mystery of marriage. And that is the call to image the very love of God. The church has always taught that the only form of birth control in keeping with human dignity is self-control. And if a man and a woman cannot say no to their desire for union, their yes means nothing. If you have a serious reason to avoid a child, well, abstain from the act that leads to children. As John Paul II said, just a couple months before he was elected Pope, it was the 10th anniversary of the encyclical Humanae Vitae, Paul VI's document which reaffirmed the Church's teaching on contraception. And Cardinal Wojtyła, just 2 months or so before he was elected, John Paul II said, what is at stake in the teaching of Humanae Vitae is nothing short of a battle for the very meaning of human existence. Perhaps one day we will look back at this period of history in the church and we will recognize that the stone the builders rejected, Humanae Vitae, was in fact the cornerstone of the culture of life.
My final question. John Paul II's teaching on theology of the body and your presentations of it have taken us a long way. But where do you see this conversation headed? What are some of the other questions that you would like to see better explored?
Well, there's so many. When you come to understand the language of the body, that's an expression John Paul uses, the language of the body speaks of the great mystery of Christ and the church. And John Paul II, in this theology of the body, he laid out a foundation, but he himself said this foundation needs to be built upon. And there's so many directions that theology will go in the next several centuries as the church absorbs this beautiful vision. I have a list of, 50 books that I want to write. And maybe if I live long enough, they'll all come out. But one of them is a tour of the creed using the theology of the body. Another one is the renewal of the liturgy through the understanding of theology of the body. All of these areas are affected by our understanding of masculinity and femininity and the call of the two to Holy Communion. John Paul II goes so far as to say that the language of the liturgy is in some way a spousal language. What is happening at the Mass, he says, is the sacrament of the bridegroom and the bride. Whoa, that needs to be explored theologically. So many other questions need to be explored. And I hope and I'm praying, and we already see the signs of it, that God is raising up an army of men and women to study this teaching and to take the church to the next level. I'm very excited. I'm very hopeful. We live in dramatic times, difficult times, even dark times. But David beat Goliath.
Well, I hope that you raise up an army of Davids here in Toronto. Thank you very much for joining us, Christopher.
You're welcome, Kris. Pleasure.
Young people are naturally the most vulnerable to distortions of sexuality, bombarded by confusing mixed messages and often still figuring out where God fits in it all. They sometimes don't know where to turn for answers. Thankfully, more resources are exploring their sensitive questions for them, including that most common, if problematic one, how far can we go? Joining me now in studio are the authors of How Far Can We Go? A Catholic Guide to Sex and Dating, Brett Salkeld, Leah Perrault. Leah, the title of your book certainly begs the question, how far can we go in a dating relationship?
Well, the short answer, Kris, is it depends, which of course isn't so short. When we first started doing this work, we were asked to do a presentation for a friend of ours and her youth group. And we sent out a survey asking them, what would you like to know about Catholic sexuality? And over 90% of the kids came back with some variation of how far can you go? And so our work for the last several years has been really focused on answering that question in a way that prepares young people for Catholic marriage.
What is God calling you to give in this relationship? If you're a married person, part of that physical gift will be sexual intimacy, right? So how far can we go? Well, if you're married, you can have sex, right? The key is giving people a framework when they're not in a married relationship for figuring out what they're called to in a given relationship. And that means looking at the rest of your relationship. What kind of relationship are you in with this person emotionally, intellectually, spiritually? So what we really try to do is give people tools for discernment.
One of the quotes that particularly struck me, and it seems to touch on that, sexual sin is using your body to lie to your partner and probably yourself about the nature of your relationship. How is, Leah, how is sexual sin being dishonest?
John Paul really develops in the Theology of the Body the idea of the language of the body, that we speak a language with our body. And that's very clear when we cross our arms and get upset with someone or give them an evil eye. But of course, sex is part of the way that we speak with the language of our body. And when we sin with sexuality, we're saying something like sex says, I give my whole self to you, my whole, in the context of my whole life. And when you're not married, if you have sex with someone, your body says, I give my whole self to you, but the rest of your life doesn't.
It does seem that a lot of young people, though, have rejected the church's understanding of chastity and just a general Christian ethic of chastity. Why do you think that they don't seem to be embracing this?
If you don't believe that there's any sort of absolutes, it's easy to find justification to do what you want when you're not grounded in something that you believe very firmly. But chastity has never been easy. I mean, we can read St. Augustine 1700 years ago. We shouldn't make it sound like this is the only generation that's ever struggled with this. But there are things in our culture that do make it tougher.
I think it's also important that we recognize that scare tactics don't work very well. As a church, we sometimes say, well, you should obey us because if you don't, something awful will happen to you. Sexually transmitted infections, unexpected pregnancies. And there are in fact many positive reasons to practice the church's teaching relating to sexuality and the virtue of purity and chastity, simply because they do good things for us. They develop virtues, they make us into people who can honor and value one another in all sorts of relationships.
Now, it seems like this area, the church's teaching on sexuality, is quite controversial. Do you think that part of that can be attributed to the gray areas, certain things that haven't been definitively defined, and so there's room for discussion or debate?
Well, church teaching on dating is virtually non-existent. Dating as a form of discerning marriage is like 50 or 60 years old. In Vatican II, there's half a sentence about after an honorable courtship. That's about it. There's a lot of things like how old should someone be? The church doesn't say anything. Everyone knows the church says no sex before marriage, but the church doesn't have any teaching on French kissing. The church doesn't have any teaching on holding hands. So we need to give people a framework to learn how to address these questions in their context, and that means dealing in gray area, and some people aren't comfortable in gray area. They want a hard line, and if the church hasn't given one, they'll invent one and pretend that the church gave it.
What's your take on firm rules, guidelines for teens?
Lots of parents ask us questions about how they can provide guidelines for their children, and we think those guidelines are really important, that parents and pastors and teachers play a really important role in shaping the world that their teens particularly are living in. We really see our book addressing teens that maybe haven't already been convinced about the church's teaching on sexuality, and we're trying to speak into a place where they maybe haven't been convinced by friends who are already signed up and sold on the idea of chastity.
Well, it's a very important book. Thank you very much for joining us, Leah and Brett.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Kris.
The crossroads of faith and sexuality, two of the most powerful human impulses, is a hazardous intersection for anyone to navigate. But emboldened by John Paul II, who came before them, new thinkers have emerged to provide a liberating alternative to a sexual revolution that has left so many dissatisfied. We want to know what you think about God, sex, and Christopher West. Send us an email at focus@saltandlighttv.org. For Catholic Focus, I'm Kris Dmytrenko.